Good evening. Tonight, we find solace in the sacred story of a vision that became a bridge between worlds, the heavenly vision of Jacob's ladder. We will journey with a lonely traveler, a man fleeing from his past and uncertain of his future, who laid his head upon a simple stone in the middle of a vast and silent wilderness. It was there, in the deepest dark, under a canopy of indifferent stars, that the heavens opened. This is a story about how the most desolate places can become holy ground, and how the hardest pillows can bring the most divine dreams. It reminds us of a comforting, unshakable truth that God's presence is not reserved for the sanctuary or the saint. He meets us right where we are, especially when we are lost, broken, and feel utterly alone. His grace descends not because we have earned it, but because we desperately need it. So, before you get truly comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely appreciate what I do here. I also invite you to post your location and local time in the comments below. It is a wonderful thing to know that as we find our rest, we are part of a quiet community, listening together all around the world. Now, dim your screen. Perhaps turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story does not begin in that lonely field, but decades earlier, within the quiet tents of a man named Isaac. Isaac was himself a miracle, the long-awaited son of Abraham and Sarah, the child of laughter and promise, through whom God had sworn to build a great nation. He had walked with his father to a mountain named Moriah, had felt the binding ropes and seen the glint of the sacrificial knife, and he had learned in the most profound way possible that God was a provider. He carried within him the memory of a ram caught in the thicket, a symbol of divine intervention at the very last moment. And so, Isaac, the heir of this incredible covenant, lived his life with a quiet and gentle faith. He had taken a wife, a beautiful woman from his ancestral homeland named Rebekah. In the ancient world, the continuation of a family line was not merely a personal desire. It was a sacred duty, a sign of blessing, and the very vessel through which God's promises were carried forward. Yet, for 20 long years, Isaac and Rebekah's tents remained silent. The laughter of children did not echo across the encampment, just as his own mother, Sarah, had known the ache of barrenness. So too did his beloved Rebekah. Theologians still reflect on the deeper meaning of this recurring theme in the patriarchal narratives. It seems that at every critical juncture, God paused the natural course of events, creating a space of human impossibility so that his divine power would be made unmistakably clear. The great nation he was building would not be a product of human strength or ambition, but of divine grace and miraculous intervention, a story written by his hand from the very first chapter. Isaac did not turn to foreign gods or grow bitter in his waiting. Instead, the scriptures tell us he prayed for his wife. He pleaded with the Lord on her behalf. It was an intimate, persistent prayer, a husband's gentle intercession for the desire of his wife's heart and for the fulfillment of the promise that rested upon their household. And the Lord, in his time, heard him. Rebekah conceived. The long silence was broken, and a new hope filled their days. But this long-awaited blessing was not a peaceful one. Soon, Rebekah felt a violent and perplexing struggle within her. It was more than the gentle stirrings of new life. It was a war, a tumultuous tumbling of two distinct lives vying for dominance inside her own body. Her days were filled with a profound sense of unease. The joy of her answered prayer was clouded by this constant internal strife. It was a physical and spiritual torment that left her asking a question that echoes through the ages when suffering comes dressed as a blessing. If all is well, why am I like this? Her confusion did not lead her to despair, but to seek answers from the only source she knew. She went to inquire of the Lord. In some tellings of the story, this meant going to a place of worship, or perhaps seeking out a holy man, like Melchizedek, who had blessed her father-in-law, Abraham. Whatever the method, her act was one of pure faith. She took her confusion and her pain and laid it before God, trusting that He who had given this life would also give her understanding. The answer she received was not one of simple reassurance, but a prophecy that would define the rest of her life and the course of history. The Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." This was a staggering revelation. It was not just two sons she was carrying, but the progenitors of two entire nations destined for conflict. And in a complete reversal of all cultural and traditional law, the right of the firstborn was to be overturned by divine decree. The elder, the one who would emerge first, was destined to serve his younger brother. It was a divine disruption of human order, a mystery of faith that placed God's sovereign choice above all earthly claims. With this divine word, the stage was set. The birth of these children would not be just a family event, but the beginning of a long and often painful story of rivalry, deception, and ultimately, divine purpose. The struggle in her womb was only the beginning of a struggle that would echo for generations. The days of Rebekah's difficult pregnancy came to their end, and the prophecy began to take physical form. As the midwives attended to her, the first of the twins emerged into the world. He was a wonder to behold, his skin flush with a deep, ruddy color, and his small body covered in a good downy hair, like a miniature garment woven from the wild places he would one day love. They named him Esau, a name that would forever be linked to his rugged, earthy appearance. He was a child born with the wilderness already clinging to him. But the moment was not his alone. As he entered the world, a tiny hand emerged with him, the hand of his brother, grasping firmly onto his heel. It was a sign, a dramatic and living portrait of the prophecy Rebekah held in her heart. This second son was named Jacob, or Yaakov in the ancient tongue, a name derived from the Hebrew word for heel. But its meaning was deeper, a name that also signified one who follows closely, one who trips up, one who supplants. From his very first breath, his identity was intertwined with that of his elder brother, forever grasping, forever following, forever destined to overtake. The two boys grew, and as the years passed, the subtle differences present at their birth blossomed into two starkly different natures, two paths diverging from the same tent. Esau fulfilled the promise of his rugged birth. He was a boy who could not be contained by the soft walls of a tent. He was drawn to the open spaces, to the heat of the sun, and the feel of the earth beneath his feet. The wind that swept across the plains of Canaan seemed to call his name. He learned the ways of the wild, the tracks of the gazelle, the flight of the bird. He became a skillful hunter, his hands strong and sure on the bow, his eyes sharp. He was a man of the senses, a man of action and impulse. His life was lived in the tangible world of dust, sweat, and the thrill of the chase. He brought home game from the field, a physical provider whose contributions could be seen, touched, and tasted. Jacob, however, was another soul entirely. While Esau sought the horizon, Jacob found his world within the familiar circle of the encampment. The scriptures describe him as a quiet man, dwelling in tents. He was a man of the hearth, not the open field. His world was one of observation, of listening to the stories of the elders, of understanding the subtle rhythms of the flocks and the household. Where Esau was impulsive, Jacob was contemplative, where Esau was a man of instinct. Jacob was a man of thought and strategy. He learned not how to track a deer, but how to track the movements of the human heart. His strength was not in the bowstring, but in his patience and his quiet, watchful intelligence. He was a planner, a dweller, a man whose spirit was as smooth and thoughtful as his brother's was rough and immediate. These opposing natures created a quiet but powerful rift that split the family's affections down the middle. A home that should have been united by the miracle of their birth was instead divided by preference. Isaac, now growing older, his eyes beginning to dim, loved Esau. His love was simple, sensory, and deeply connected to his own appetites. The scripture tells us plainly, he loved Esau because he had a taste for the wild game his son brought home. It was a love that could be satisfied with a well-cooked meal, a father's pride in the primal, masculine strength of his firstborn son, Isaac, the gentle shepherd, the man of quiet contemplation, perhaps saw in Esau a strength and freedom that he himself had never fully embodied. Rebekah, however, loved Jacob. Her love was woven from different threads. Perhaps she saw in his quiet, thoughtful nature a reflection of her own strategic mind. Perhaps, as he stayed within the camp, he was simply the son she knew better, the one who listened to her and shared in the life of the tents. But deeper than all of this, she carried the memory of the prophecy. She knew that God's plan, his mysterious and unchangeable word, rested upon her younger son. It remains one of the great mysteries of faith, why God's favor was placed upon the younger, quieter son. A divine choice that defied all the traditions of their time. For in the ancient world, the position of the firstborn was of immense significance. The birthright was not merely a title, it was a concrete inheritance of a double portion of the father's estate, and the blessing was the spiritual transfer of authority, making the firstborn the patriarch and priest of the family upon his father's death. Rebekah's love for Jacob was therefore not just maternal affection. It was an investment in what she believed to be God's chosen destiny. And so the family lived in a state of quiet imbalance. Two brothers, one the heir by tradition, the other the heir by prophecy. One favored by the father, the other by the mother. This division was not loud or violent in these early years, but it laid a foundation of silent competition and unspoken tensions. Esau, confident in his strength and his father's love, likely thought little of the future. He lived in the present moment, for the thrill of the hunt and the satisfaction of a good meal. Jacob, however, lived with the future always in his mind. He watched. He waited. And he understood the value of the things his brother took for granted. The prophecy hung in the air of the encampment, a silent promise waiting for the moment of human weakness through which it would finally begin to be fulfilled. The two boys, now young men, continued on their divergent paths, each day further cementing the natures they were born with. Esau's world was the vast, sun-scorched expanse of the Canaanite landscape. Jacob's was the intricate, close-knit world of the camp. And it was on an otherwise ordinary day, a day that began like any other, that their two worlds would finally collide, setting in motion the first tangible fulfillment of the prophecy Rebecca held so close to her heart. The event itself was not one of grand drama or overt conflict, but of quiet opportunity and profound weakness. A transaction that would alter the course of their lineage forever. It began with hunger. Esau had been in the open country for hours, perhaps since dawn, his bow in hand, his senses alert. But the hunt had been fruitless. The wild game had eluded him, and the relentless sun had beaten down upon him, draining his strength. As he made his way back to the encampment, his every step was heavy with fatigue. He returned not with the prize of a gazelle over his shoulders, but with a deep, gnawing emptiness in his stomach. It was a primal, all-consuming hunger, the kind that blurs the edges of the world and reduces all thought to a single, desperate need. He was weary to his very soul, faint from a day of fruitless labor. As he neared the familiar sight of the tents, a scent reached him, carried on the warm evening air. It was a rich, earthy aroma, the smell of something slow-cooked and deeply satisfying. He followed it to his brother's side. There was Jacob, true to his nature, tending a pot that bubbled gently over a low fire. He was making a stew of red lentils. It was a simple, nourishing meal, but to the starving Esau, it was the most desirable thing on earth. The deep, crimson color of the pottage seemed to mirror the burning need within him. It was the color of life, of sustenance, of immediate relief from the agony of his hunger. Esau stumbled toward his brother, his voice raspy with exhaustion. The words he spoke were not a polite request, but a desperate, guttural demand. "Quick," he pleaded, "let me have some of that red stuff, for I am about to die." In his exhaustion, he did not even give the food a name. It was simply that red stuff, an object of pure, unthinking desire. It is a lesser-known detail that this very moment is what earned him his alternate name, Edom, which means red. His identity became forever linked to this moment of carnal desperation, a man defined by the color of the stew for which he would sell his soul. Jacob looked up at his brother, at his sweat-streaked face and weary eyes, and saw his chance. His response was not one of brotherly compassion, but of startling, ice-cold calculation. He had been waiting for a moment like this, a moment when his brother's strength would be his weakness. His voice was quiet, even, but his demand was monumental. "First," he said, "sell me your birthright." There it was, the prize he had watched from afar, the inheritance promised by prophecy, but held by tradition, was now within his grasp. He was leveraging a temporary, physical need against an eternal, spiritual, and material inheritance. It is a profound and often uncomfortable mystery how God's sovereign plan can be woven through the tangled threads of human weakness and sin. The text of the scripture does not praise Jacob for this act of cold opportunism. It simply records it. Jacob's actions were cunning and born of a deep, perhaps obsessive desire for the blessing he felt was destined to be his. He saw his brother's desperation not as a cause for charity, but as a point of leverage. For Esau, the choice was no choice at all. His world had shrunk to the size of his empty stomach. The future, the leadership of the clan, the double portion of his father's immense wealth, the spiritual mantle of Abraham. These were all vague, distant concepts. His hunger was real, immediate, and excruciating. "Look, I am about to die," he exclaimed, his voice thick with self-pity. "What good is the birthright to me?" In that moment, he did what the scripture says he had always done in his heart. He despised his birthright. He held in contempt the sacred trust that was his by birth, viewing it as worthless in the face of temporary discomfort. Jacob, seeing his victory, pressed his advantage. This was not to be a casual agreement that could be renounced later. He needed it to be binding. "Swear an oath to me first," he insisted. In their culture, an oath was the most solemn and unbreakable of contracts, a vow made before God himself. And so Esau, in his reckless, thoughtless hunger, swore the oath. He legally, spiritually, and irrevocably transferred his inheritance, his future, and his identity as the firstborn to his younger twin. The transaction was complete. The great transfer of patriarchal authority was sealed. And then Jacob, the new owner of the birthright, simply ladled out the stew. He gave his brother the bread and the pottage of lentils. Esau ate and drank, and when his hunger was satisfied and his strength had returned, he simply stood up and walked away. There was no remorse, no moment of clarity, no horrifying realization of what he had done. The most sacred inheritance of his generation had been sold for a single meal, and he departed as thoughtlessly as he had arrived. The prophecy had taken its first great leap toward fulfillment, not in a clash of swords, but in the quiet clinking of a spoon against a clay bowl. Years passed. The quiet transaction in the tent, the trading of a birthright for a bowl of crimson stew, settled into the family's history, perhaps becoming a half-forgotten memory for the impulsive Esau. But for Jacob and Rebekah, it was a secret held between them, the first step in the fulfillment of a prophecy that guided their every move. The two brothers continued to live their separate lives, one in the field, one in the tent, and the household of Isaac existed in its state of quiet, divided affection. The days turned into seasons, and the seasons into decades. Isaac, the son of promise, grew old. The strength of his youth faded, and a veil of darkness fell over his eyes, leaving him blind to the world of light and shadow he had known for so long. His world became one of sound and touch, of memory and smell. It is in this state of physical blindness, a condition that so poignantly mirrored his spiritual blindness to the true natures of his sons, that Isaac felt the end of his life drawing near. He felt the familiar weight of his mortality and knew that the time had come to perform his final, most sacred duty as patriarch. He had to bestow the blessing, the powerful, prophetic utterance that would shape the destiny of his descendants. It was a spoken will, an irrevocable transfer of spiritual authority and divine favor. And in his heart, there was no question as to who should receive it. He called for his firstborn, his favorite son. "Esau," he said, his voice thin with age. When Esau came to his side, Isaac gave him a final charge, a request steeped in the very nature of their lifelong bond. "I am now an old man," he said, "and I don't know the day of my death. So take your weapons, your quiver and bow, and go out to the open country to hunt some wild game for me. Prepare me the food I love, that savory dish, and bring it to me to eat. Then my soul will bless you before I die." It was to be a final feast, a last taste of the wildness he so admired in his son. The blessing of the covenant, the spiritual inheritance of Abraham, was to be given in exchange for the satisfaction of his appetite. He sought to connect with his son in the only way he truly knew how, through the shared pleasure of a meal. But these words, spoken in the privacy of the tent, were not private at all. Rebecca was listening. Perhaps she stood just outside the tent flap, her heart pounding as she heard her husband's plan. In that moment, she must have felt a surge of panic. The prophecy, the word from God that she had carried like a secret fire in her soul for so many years, was about to be undone by her husband's simple, earthly craving. His love for Esau was about to defy the declared will of God. She knew she had to act, and act quickly, her mind as sharp and strategic as ever, formulated a plan. She went at once to Jacob, her voice urgent. "I have just heard your father speaking to your brother Esau," she said, recounting the entire conversation. Her plan was audacious, a deception born of fierce conviction. "Now, my son," she commanded, "listen carefully and do what I say. Go out to the flock and bring me 2 of the best young goats, so I can prepare some tasty food for your father, just the way he likes it. Then you will take it to your father to eat, so that he may give you his blessing before he dies." Jacob, for all his cunning, was taken aback. He hesitated, not out of moral objection to the deceit, but out of a very practical fear. "But my brother Esau is a hairy man," he reasoned, "and I am a man with smooth skin. What if my father touches me? He will know I am tricking him. I will bring a curse upon myself, not a blessing." He saw the flaw in the plan, the risk of discovery. His greatest fear was not the lie itself, but the consequence of the lie being exposed. The curse of a patriarch was as powerful and binding as his blessing, and Jacob wanted no part of it. Rebekah's response was swift and absolute, a stunning display of maternal resolve. She would not let his fear stand in the way of what she believed to be their destiny. "My son," she said, her voice filled with an unshakable certainty, "let any curse that comes be on me. Just do as I say. Go and get them for me." She took the full weight of the potential consequences upon herself. It was an astonishing act. Theologians have long wrestled with this passage, where human deceit becomes the unlikely vessel for divine purpose. Rebekah was so convinced that she was aligning her actions with God's preordained plan that she was willing to stand in the path of a divine curse to see it fulfilled. Her fierce resolve overcame Jacob's fear. He obeyed. He went and brought the 2 young goats, and Rebekah, with the skill of a master chef, prepared the savory dish. Her hands worked quickly, her mind focused on replicating the taste and smell that her husband loved so dearly. But the taste alone would not be enough. The deception had to be a complete sensory illusion. She went to Esau's belongings and took out his best clothes, garments that would carry his distinct, outdoorsy scent of the open field. She dressed Jacob in his brother's robes. Then, for the final, crucial touch, she took the soft skins of the young goats and carefully covered Jacob's smooth hands and the back of his neck. The disguise was complete. He now smelled like Esau, and should his blind father reach out to touch him, he would feel like Esau. Armed with the tempting dish and cloaked in this elaborate falsehood, Jacob walked toward his father's tent. The blessing of a generation hung in the balance, resting now on a desperate, calculated lie. With the warm, savory dish in his hands and the rough, deceptive skins on his arms, Jacob stepped into the shadows of his father's tent. The air inside was still and thick with the scent of aged leather and spices. He approached the bed where the old patriarch lay, his heart surely pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "My father," he said, his voice a careful imitation of his brother's confidence. The old man stirred, his sightless eyes turning toward the sound. "Yes," he answered. "Who is it, my son?" There was a tremor of uncertainty in his voice. The sound was not quite right. Jacob took a breath and spoke the first great lie. "I am Esau, your firstborn," he declared. "I have done as you told me. Please sit up and eat some of my game, so that your soul may bless me." The speed of his success seemed to trouble the old man. Isaac, who knew the rhythms of the hunt better than anyone, was suspicious. "How did you find it so quickly, my son?" he asked, a gentle probing from the darkness. Jacob's reply was a breathtaking escalation of his deceit, for he brought the holy name of God into his falsehood. "The Lord your God gave me success," he said, the words a shield for his lie. It was a moment of profound transgression, using a claim of divine favor to conceal human treachery. Still, Isaac was not convinced. The voice was the voice of Jacob. An unsettling doubt remained. "Come near," he said, "so I may touch you, my son, to know whether you are really my son Esau or not." This was the critical moment. the test upon which the entire scheme depended. Jacob moved closer, extending his disguised hands. Isaac's own frail, wrinkled hands reached out, searching in the darkness. They brushed against the goatskins, feeling the rough, hairy texture that he had associated with his firstborn son for his entire life. He sighed, a sound of deep, tragic confusion, and then he spoke the heart-breaking words that have echoed through the ages. The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. His intuition warred with his senses, and tragically, his senses won. He did not recognize him, the scripture says, because his hands were hairy, like his brother Esau's. He asked one final time, a last plea for certainty. "Are you really my son, Esau?" And Jacob, now past the point of no return, answered simply, "I am." His doubts finally laid to rest, Isaac allowed himself to be served. Jacob brought him the food and the wine, and the old man ate. Then, with the taste of the savory meat still on his lips, he drew his disguised son near, kissed him, and breathed in the scent of Esau's clothes, the scent of the open field, and the words of the blessing, the great and irrevocable torrent of prophetic power poured forth. It was a blessing of abundance and dominion. May God give you of heaven's dew and of earth's richness. May nations serve you, and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. The words filled the tent, sealing Jacob's destiny and disinheriting his brother. As soon as the blessing was complete, and Jacob had slipped away from his father's tent, the sound of another's approach could be heard. It was Esau. He had returned from a successful hunt, his heart full of anticipation. He skillfully prepared the savory dish his father loved and brought it before him with a voice full of cheerful confidence. "My father," he said, "please sit up and eat some of your son's game, so you may give me your blessing." A violent tremor seized the old patriarch. Isaac began to shake uncontrollably, the full, horrifying weight of the deception crashing down upon him. "Who?" he gasped. "Who was it, then? Who hunted game and brought it to me? I ate it all, just before you came, and I have blessed him, and indeed, he will remain blessed." The finality in his voice was absolute. At these words, Esau let out a loud and bitter cry, a sound of shattered anguish. The blessing he had lived his entire life expecting was gone. "Bless me," he wept. "Me too, my father." But Isaac could only confirm the terrible truth. "Your brother came deceitfully and has taken your blessing." The rage in Esau's heart erupted. "Isn't he rightly named Jacob?" he roared, the name now a bitter curse on his tongue. "He has supplanted me these 2 times. He took my birthright, and now he has taken my blessing." He wept again, begging his father for any blessing that might be left. Isaac, with a heavy heart, gave him a lesser prophecy, one of a life away from the richness of the earth, a life of conflict where he would serve his brother. The love Esau had for his father was now eclipsed by the hatred he held for his brother. He nursed a silent, murderous grudge. In his heart, he made a bitter oath. "The days of mourning for my father are approaching," he thought to himself. "After that, I will kill my brother Jacob." This dark promise, this whispered vow of vengeance, did not remain a secret for long. Word of his threat reached Rebekah. Her plan had succeeded, but the cost was terrifying. The son she had fought to bless was now a marked man. Her deception had secured his destiny, but it had also shattered her family and unleashed a threat of bloodshed. Once again, she acted decisively, summoning Jacob and urging him to flee. "Your brother Esau is consoling himself with the thought of killing you," she warned. "Flee at once to my brother Laban in Haran. Stay there for a while until your brother's anger subsides." And so, Jacob, the man who now held the blessing, was forced to become a fugitive. He had won the future, but in doing so, he had lost his home, his family, and his safety, forced to run for his life into the lonely, unknown wilderness. And so, the plan for Jacob's flight was set into motion, veiled in a guise of familial duty. Rebekah, ever the strategist, knew that Jacob could not simply vanish. His departure needed a formal purpose, a reason that would satisfy her blind husband and legitimize the long journey. She presented her case to Isaac, her words a masterful blend of genuine concern and subtle manipulation. She spoke of her weariness with the local women, the Hittite wives that Esau had taken, women who were a source of grief to both her and Isaac. "I'm disgusted with my life because of these Hittite women," she lamented. "If Jacob also takes a wife from among them, from this land, my life will not be worth living." Her words struck a chord of truth. For the preservation of their spiritual and cultural lineage was of paramount importance. Her argument was successful. Isaac, accepting the necessity of the plan, summoned Jacob to his side once more. Here, in the quiet of the tent, a remarkable and often overlooked event took place. There was no longer any deception. Isaac, now fully aware of the divine will that had been set in motion, willingly and formally bestowed a second blessing upon his younger son. This was not a blessing stolen in the dark, but one given in the open, a father's official commissioning of his heir. He charged Jacob not to take a wife from among the Canaanites, but to journey to the house of his mother's family and find a wife there. And then he blessed him again. His words, now explicitly confirming the great covenant of his own father, Abraham. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and increase your numbers until you become a community of peoples. Isaac prayed, his frail hands perhaps resting on his son's head. May he give you and your descendants the blessing of Abraham, so that you may take possession of this land where you now live as a foreigner, the land God gave to Abraham. It was a moment of profound significance. The stolen blessing had secured Jacob's personal dominion, but this blessing secured his role in salvation history. He was now, without any doubt, the patriarch in waiting, the chosen vessel of the covenant. He was leaving as a fugitive, but he was also leaving as the anointed heir of the greatest promise God had ever made to a man. The farewells were likely brief and heavy with unspoken fears. A final embrace from the mother who had risked everything for him. A solemn, perhaps distant, farewell from the father he had deceived. And then Jacob turned his back on the only home he had ever known. He walked away from the vast encampment at Beersheba, a place teeming with life and immense wealth. He left behind the thousands of sheep and goats, the herds of cattle, the loyal servants, the chests of silver and gold that constituted his father's estate. He was the heir to all of it, yet he departed with nothing. The scripture, in a moment of poignant simplicity, later has Jacob recall this moment, saying, "I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan." That single image, a man leaving a life of wealth with only a staff in his hand, is a powerful summary of his new reality. In the ancient world, a staff was the essential tool of the traveler and the shepherd. It was a walking aid for the long and wearying journey, a defense against predators in the wilderness, and a tool to guide the flock. It was a symbol of a life of wandering, of having no permanent home. For Jacob to leave with only his staff was to be stripped of every comfort, every privilege, every ounce of his former status. He was no longer the quiet son dwelling in tents, sheltered by his mother's love. He was a solitary wanderer, his identity reduced to its absolute, barest essential, a man on a journey. It is a recurring pattern in the sacred narrative that the path to true blessing often leads directly through the wilderness of loss and desolation. Jacob had grasped and schemed his way to the top, only to find himself at the very bottom, cast out into the world with nothing to his name. Theologians often point to this moment as a crucial step in Jacob's spiritual journey. He had to be emptied of all his reliance on his own cunning and his family's wealth so that he could learn, in the crushing silence of the wilderness, to rely on God alone. The blessing he had stolen in his own strength would now have to be lived out in complete and utter dependence on the God who had promised it. He took his first steps on the long road north toward Haran, a journey of hundreds of miles through harsh and unfamiliar territory. Behind him lay the tents of Beersheba, shimmering in the desert heat, a life he could not return to. Before him lay an unknown future in a distant land. Every footstep took him further away from the brother who wanted him dead, and deeper into the lonely expanse of the wilderness. He was a solitary figure against a vast landscape, the anointed patriarch with a staff in his hand and a heavy blessing on his soul, walking toward a destiny he could not yet comprehend. The familiar tents of Beersheba, the last bastion of everything he had ever known, shrank behind him until they were consumed by the shimmering heat of the desert air. Jacob was now truly alone, a solitary man swallowed by a vast and unforgiving landscape. The path north to Haran was not a gentle road. It was a journey into the heart of the wilderness, a place the ancient Hebrews called the Midbar. This was not a lush forest or a green pasture, but a world of stone and dust, of silence and survival. Every step he took was a step deeper into an environment designed to strip a man of all comfort and pretense. During the day, the sun was a relentless master. It beat down from a cloudless, metallic sky, bleaching the color from the rolling limestone hills and baking the very ground he walked upon. The world around him was a monotonous palette of pale yellows, chalky whites, and dusty browns, broken only by the occasional thorny shrub or a resilient, hardy bush clinging stubbornly to life in a dry ravine. Heat radiated in shimmering waves from the stony ground, creating mirages in the distance that promised water but offered only more desolation. The air was thick with a fine, chalky dust that coated his skin, his clothes, and the back of his throat, fueling a constant, gnawing thirst. He was a man accustomed to the cool shade of a tent, and this raw, unfiltered exposure to the elements was a harsh and constant assault on his senses. The sounds of his former life, the bleating of sheep, the lowing of cattle, the murmur of voices from the tents were replaced by a profound and overwhelming silence. The quiet of the wilderness was a living thing, an immense presence that pressed in on him. The only sounds were the ones he made himself. The rhythmic crunch of his sandals on the gravel, the soft tap of his staff against the rocks, the sound of his own strained breathing. Occasionally, this deep silence would be punctuated by the lonely cry of a hawk circling high overhead, or the skittering of a lizard across a sun-baked stone. But for hours on end, there was nothing but the soundless expanse, an emptiness that forced him inward, leaving him alone with the loud company of his own thoughts. It is one of the profound paradoxes of the spiritual life that the soul must often be led into a place of utter barrenness in order to become truly fruitful. The wilderness in the sacred narrative is consistently a place of testing and transformation. It was in the wilderness that Israel was forged into a nation. It was to the wilderness that David fled from Saul. It was in the wilderness that Elijah heard the still, small voice of God. And it was into the wilderness that Jesus himself was led to be tested. It is a place where all earthly support systems are removed, where one cannot rely on wealth, status, or family. It is a place of forced dependence, a crucible designed to burn away the impurities of the soul. For Jacob, the master planner and supplanter, this journey was not a punishment, but a necessary preparation. The cunning and self-reliance that had defined his life so far were useless here. As the sun began its descent, painting the western sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, the oppressive heat would give way to a sudden, biting chill. The desert that had baked him by day now sought to freeze him by night. He would have to find shelter, perhaps in the shallow opening of a cave, or in the lee of a great boulder that had retained some of the day's warmth. As he would rest his weary body, the sky above would transform into a breathtaking spectacle of stars. A dark velvet dome scattered with diamond dust, more brilliant and numerous than he had ever seen from the smoky haze of the encampment. But the beauty of the night was matched by its dangers. The silence would change, now filled with the unseen movements of nocturnal creatures. The howl of a distant jackal or the guttural grunt of a hyena would be a stark reminder that he was an intruder in a world that was not his own, vulnerable and exposed. Fear was his constant companion, a cold knot in his stomach. Fear of bandits who preyed on solitary travelers, fear of predators that hunted in the darkness, and the simple, gnawing fear of the unknown path that lay before him. Each day was a trial of endurance, and each night was a test of courage, a long watch in the dark until the safety of the dawn. The journey into dust was stripping him down day by day, leaving only the man, his staff, and the heavy weight of the blessing he had yet to understand. The days on the road were a trial of physical endurance, a battle against heat, thirst, and the monotony of the dusty landscape. But the nights, in their own way, were even more challenging. As Jacob would find his resting place, and the great silence of the wilderness would descend, the external struggles of the day gave way to an internal battle that was far more relentless. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the deafening echo of his own conscience. There were no chores to distract him, no flock to tend, no conversations to be had. He was left utterly alone with the full, crushing weight of his past actions. Under the indifferent light of the stars, Jacob was forced to wrestle with the man he had become. His memories were his tormentors. He would close his eyes, but see the darkened interior of his father's tent. He would feel the phantom texture of the rough goatskins on his smooth hands, a constant, tactile reminder of his lie. Over and over, he would hear his father's voice, thick with confusion and sorrow, murmuring the words that surely pierced his heart. The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. He had exploited his father's blindness, turning a son's sacred duty of care into an act of profound betrayal. He had won the blessing, yes, but the victory was soured by the shame of how it was obtained. The savory dish he had carried now left the bitter taste of guilt in his soul. And then there was the memory of his brother. In the silence of the night, Esau's loud and bitter cry would ring in his ears. It was not the roar of an angry man, but the sound of a heart breaking, the sound of a life's expectations being shattered in a single, devastating moment. Jacob could picture his brother's face, the rugged, confident hunter reduced to a weeping, pleading child, begging for any blessing that might be left. He had not just taken an inheritance. He had stolen his brother's identity and broken his spirit. And now, Esau's subsequent vow of vengeance was a shadow that followed Jacob with every step, every rustle in the thorny bushes, every snap of a twig in the darkness could be his brother, coming to exact his promised revenge. The fear was constant, but it was a fear born from the seed of his own transgression. He would think of his mother, Rebekah, the architect of the entire scheme. Her fierce love had been his shield and his motivation. But now, alone in the wilderness, he could see the tangled web they had woven. Her conviction had become his exile. Her plan to secure his destiny had resulted in the fracturing of their family. It is a sacred mystery that sometimes the most profound work of God is done in his apparent absence. During these long days and nights of travel, God was silent. There was no prophetic word, no reassuring sign. Theologians suggest that this divine silence was a necessary space, a holy emptiness that allowed the full gravity of Jacob's own choices to settle upon him. Before he could truly hear the voice of God, he first needed to listen to the troubling voice of his own heart. He was forced to confront the meaning of his own name, Yaakov, the supplanter, the heel grabber. For so long, it may have been a source of quiet pride, a testament to his cleverness. Now it felt like a brand, a label that defined the very essence of his flawed character. He had lived up to it perfectly, and the result was this: a fugitive, sleeping on the hard ground, looking over his shoulder, his soul heavy with a blessing that felt more like a burden. What good was it to be the Lord over his brother when his brother's cry of anguish haunted his sleep? What good was the promise of land when he possessed nothing but the dust on his sandals and the staff in his hand? This internal wrestling was more exhausting than any day's journey. The sun would set, and he would lay his body down to rest. But his mind would continue its relentless march, pacing back and forth through the chambers of his memory and his guilt. The magnificent, orderly procession of the stars across the heavens stood in stark contrast to the chaos and turmoil within his soul. He was a man at war with himself, haunted by the past and terrified of the future. He was being brought, step by weary step, to the very end of his own strength, to a place of complete physical, emotional, and spiritual exhaustion. It was a necessary emptying, a hollowing out of his pride and self-reliance, to make space for an encounter he could never have planned. A divine interruption that was waiting just ahead, in a certain place, on a night that would change everything. The days of Jacob's journey began to blur into one another, each one a relentless cycle of walking, sweating, and weary endurance. He had traveled many miles from his home in Beersheba, moving steadily northward through the spine of the hill country. The landscape, while still rugged, began to shift subtly, the barren wilderness giving way to stony slopes where ancient, gnarled olive trees clung to the terraced earth. But the loneliness of the journey remained unchanged. Each sunrise was a call to walk, and each sunset was a quiet, temporary reprieve. He was a man moving through a world that was not his own, a solitary figure in a land of strangers. On one of these days, as the afternoon began to wane, a profound and bone-deep weariness settled over him. It was more than just the ache in his muscles, or the dust in his throat. It was the culmination of all the miles he had walked, and all the sleepless nights he had wrestled with his conscience. The weight of his guilt and the constant, simmering fear of his brother's vengeance had taken their toll. His spirit was as raw and worn as the leather of his sandals. He walked until his body would carry him no further. The sun, which had been his adversary for so many days, now became a gentle guide, signaling the end of his labor. He watched as it dipped toward the western horizon, its harsh, white glare softening into a warm, golden glow. The light transformed the world around him. The stony hills were bathed in hues of amber and rose, and the shadows of the olive trees grew long and blue across the ground. The world seemed to hold its breath in the quiet moments of twilight. The scripture tells us with a beautiful simplicity that he had reached a certain place, for the sun had set. It was not a famous city or a known landmark. It was an anonymous spot on the road, a place made significant only because it was here that his strength finally ran out. It was a destination chosen not by his will, but by his sheer exhaustion. There was no comfort to be found here, no welcoming tent or soft bed. There was only the land itself. His preparations for the night were the simple, practiced rituals of a man who had learned to survive in the wilderness. He would have found a place sheltered from the wind, perhaps near a cluster of rocks. He would have checked the ground for snakes or scorpions. And then he prepared for a rest that his body and soul so desperately craved. He looked around him, and in the fading light, he took one of the stones of that place and put it under his head for a pillow. This simple act is one of the most poignant details in his entire story. A stone, not a bundled cloak or a saddlebag, but a hard, cold, unforgiving piece of the very earth he was traveling over. The stone was a perfect symbol of his reality. His life had become hard. His heart was troubled. His future was uncertain. His pillow was the embodiment of his hardship, a tangible representation of his lonely, destitute condition. To lay his head upon that stone was an act of complete and utter surrender. He was so weary, so emptied of all strength and hope that he could seek rest on the very object of his discomfort. It is a beautiful mystery that our most profound encounters with the divine often do not happen on the mountaintops of spiritual victory, but in the valleys of utter exhaustion. Jacob did not prepare for what was to come through elaborate ritual, prayer, or sacrifice. He did not build an altar or offer a prayer for a vision. He simply lay down in his brokenness. Theologians note that it was in this state of complete surrender, with no strength left to plan or to strive, that heaven chose to open itself to him. He had been stripped of everything: his home, his family, his wealth, and now, finally, his own physical and emotional energy. He had reached the end of himself. As he laid his head upon the stone, the last of the light faded from the sky. The air grew cold. Above him, the first stars began to appear in the deep, velvet darkness. He closed his eyes, expecting nothing more than a few hours of fitful, dreamless sleep before another long day of walking. He was a fugitive from his past and a stranger to his future, seeking only a moment of oblivion from the pain of his present. He surrendered to the darkness, unaware that his hard pillow was about to become the foundation for the house of God. As Jacob lay there, with the unyielding stone for his pillow and the vast, silent darkness for his blanket, something finally gave way within him. It was a surrender born not of piety or of peaceful acceptance, but of a profound and multi-layered exhaustion that had finally claimed every part of his being. For many days and nights, his mind had been a relentless tormentor, a whirlwind of fear, guilt, and anxious calculation. But now, that storm had finally exhausted itself. His body, pushed beyond its limits, was shutting down, and his weary mind had no choice but to follow. His was a physical exhaustion, etched into every muscle and sinew. The hundreds of miles he had traveled on foot over rugged, unforgiving terrain had taken their toll. His feet were bruised and raw. His legs ached with a deep and persistent fire. And his back, unaccustomed to sleeping on the hard ground, was a map of sore and tender points. He had been fueled by adrenaline and fear for so long, but now that fuel was gone. All that remained was the crushing weight of his body's desperate need for rest. He had reached a point where stillness was no longer a choice, but an absolute, undeniable necessity. It was also an emotional exhaustion. The human heart can only endure so much tension before it seeks a quiet armistice. The constant fear of his brother's vengeance, a shadow that leaped from every rock and rustled in every bush, had worn his nerves thin. The profound loneliness of the journey, a stark contrast to the bustling, familial life of the encampment, had left him feeling hollowed out, a solitary speck in an indifferent world. The grief of his exile, the sorrow of leaving his mother, and the shame of his relationship with his father and brother had been a heavy burden on his soul. He had reached a state of emotional numbness, a quiet place beyond the sharp sting of fresh grief or the hot rush of immediate fear. But deepest of all was the spiritual exhaustion. For nights on end, he had wrestled with his conscience, replaying his sins until they were etched into the back of his eyelids. He had struggled with the paradox of his identity, the blessed heir of a divine covenant who felt like a cursed and condemned fugitive. This internal war, this wrestling with God and with himself, had brought him to a place of utter depletion. The supplanter had finally run out of schemes. The planner had no more strength to anticipate the dangers of the next day. The heel grabber finally relaxed his grip. This was the true surrender. It was the moment he stopped striving, stopped fighting, stopped trying to control a life that had spun so violently out of his control. It is a gentle mystery that God often waits until we are asleep to speak the truths we are too busy or too troubled to hear when we are awake. Theologians observe that in the vulnerability of sleep, our defenses are down. Our pride, our arguments, our carefully constructed identities, and our persistent anxieties can finally dissolve. The soul, freed from the constant chatter of the conscious mind, becomes like an open field, a quiet and receptive space, ready to receive a seed of divine revelation. Jacob had to be brought to this place of utter passivity, this state of complete non-resistance, before he could become a vessel for the vision God had prepared for him. He felt his breathing slow and deepen, each exhale a release of the day's tension. The faint, rhythmic chirp of a cricket, which had been a distant sound, now seemed to fade into the background of his consciousness. The feeling of the cold night air on his skin grew less sharp. The hard pressure of the stone against his skull became a dull, distant anchor to a world that was quickly slipping away. The frantic loop of his memories began to slow, the images blurring at the edges, the sharp voices of his family growing faint and indistinct. He was not falling into a light, fitful slumber, but sinking into a deep, dark, and dreamless abyss of pure oblivion. He was a fearful fugitive, and for the first time in a long time, he was about to find a moment's peace. Into that profound and total silence, into the blank canvas of his exhausted mind, something new began to form. Not a memory, not a worry, but a light from another world. The descent into sleep was total, a fall into a bottomless well of quiet and darkness. The fugitive Jacob, worn down by the road and his own heart, had finally found a complete cessation of striving. The weight of his body on the hard ground, the chill of the night air, the vast and starry sky, all the sensations of the physical world dissolved into nothingness. His consciousness, untethered from the world of worry and fear, drifted in a formless void. It was a state of pure being, a quiet slate upon which a new reality could be drawn. And it was into this profound silence, this utter emptiness, that the dream began. It did not start with a sound or a voice, but with the emergence of a structure from the very fabric of the darkness. At first, it may have been just a glimmer, a faint line of silver light in the vast blackness of his sleeping mind. But slowly, steadily, it grew in substance and scale, taking on a form that was both breathtakingly strange and deeply familiar. What Jacob saw was not a simple, rickety ladder made of wood. The Hebrew word used, solam, evokes something far grander. A word whose roots connect to the great temple stairways of the ancient world. It was a sight his grandfather, Abraham, would have known from the Mesopotamian city of Ur-Ziggurat, a man-made mountain with a great, sweeping staircase reaching toward the heavens. This structure that rose in his dream was a celestial version of those ancient towers, a highway to the divine. It seemed to be made not of earthly brick or stone, but of solidified light, or perhaps of a polished, ethereal substance that glowed with a soft, internal luminescence. It was immensely wide, a grand ramp, or a majestic set of stairs, built on a scale that dwarfed any human creation. The dream was intensely real, and he could perceive its foundation, set solidly upon the very ground where he lay sleeping. This was its first miracle. The sacred pathway was not in some distant, mythical realm, but was planted right here, in this dusty, anonymous field, in this place of his suffering and exhaustion. From this firm, earthly foundation, the great stairway ascended, rising up and up, past the limits of the imagined landscape, past the highest clouds, and into the deepest reaches of the cosmos. Its top, the scripture says, reached to heaven itself. It was a tangible, visible connection between the world of humanity and the realm of God. A bridge that spanned the seemingly infinite chasm between the profane and the sacred. The sight was one of utter awe. The loneliness of the wilderness was suddenly filled with this silent, majestic presence. The darkness of the night was pushed back by its gentle, holy light. It is a profound mystery why the first image God revealed to this broken and guilt-ridden fugitive was not a throne of judgment or a word of stern correction, but a bridge. Jacob, who had spent his life creating divisions between himself and his brother within his own family, was now shown a vision of divine connection. He, who had been cast out and disconnected from all he knew, was shown that a pathway to heaven was right there beside him. Theologians have long contemplated the symbolism of the Sulam. It stands in stark contrast to the story of another great tower from his own ancestral past, the Tower of Babel. There, humanity, in its pride, tried to build its own stairway to the heavens, an act of arrogant self-reliance that ended in confusion and scattering. But here in Jacob's dream, the stairway is not a human construction. It is a divine provision. It is simply there. It is a radical declaration that the connection between heaven and earth is not something humanity must struggle to build, but something God has already established. In the dream, Jacob was purely an observer. He was not climbing the stairway, nor was he tempted to. His role was simply to witness, to behold the reality that had been unveiled to him. He was a spectator to a cosmic truth that had existed long before his troubled sleep and would exist long after. His own striving, his own plans, his own carefully constructed deceits. All of it seemed so small and insignificant in the face of this gilant, glowing structure that so effortlessly linked the dust at his feet with the home of God. The sight filled the emptiness of his dreamscape. A single, awesome object of contemplation. It was a pathway, a road, a highway of light. And as he watched, its silent majesty became the stage for the next part of the vision. For he would soon see that this divine bridge was not empty. The great and silent stairway stood in the darkness of Jacob's dream, a majestic and unmoving testament to a connection he never knew existed. It was a structure of immense peace, a solid and stable pathway in a life that had become fluid and uncertain. As he watched, his sleeping soul held in a state of pure, silent awe, the vision began to shift. The static portrait was about to become a living procession. The silence remained, but it was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of holy purpose, for the great stairway was not empty. Upon its luminous steps, there was movement. Beings of light began to appear, their forms perhaps indistinct and fluid, as things often are in dreams. But their presence was unmistakable. These were the Malachim, the messengers of God, the angels of the Lord. They were not arriving with a grand trumpet blast or a chorus of sound. Their presence was as quiet and as natural as the light of which they seemed to be made. They moved with a grace and a purpose that was utterly serene, their every motion deliberate and unhurried. They were the residents of this heavenly highway, the divine couriers for whom this bridge had been established. And they were moving in a continuous, rhythmic flow. The scripture describes a constant, two-way traffic. They were ascending and descending on the stairway. It was a vision of ceaseless activity, a silent, holy bustle that revealed the true nature of the cosmos. The angels descending were a visible representation of God's active and intimate involvement in the affairs of the world. They were his hands, his feet, his voice, carrying messages of comfort, acts of protection, and whispers of guidance down to the dusty plane of human existence. Their descent was a powerful, visual promise that heaven is not a distant, disinterested kingdom, but a loving and engaged reality, constantly reaching down into the pain and confusion of the world. For Jacob, a man who felt utterly abandoned and cut off, this was a staggering revelation. Even more wondrous was the sight of the angels ascending. They were climbing up from the earth, returning to the celestial heights from which the others came. They were the bearers of reports, the carriers of prayers, the messengers returning to the throne of God with news from the world below. The vision was of a complete and perfect circuit of communication, a divine feedback loop in which the needs of the earth were constantly being brought before the attention of heaven. It was a picture of a universe held together not by chance or by fate, but by a fabric of constant, loving, and purposeful divine administration. It is a subtle but profound detail, a lesser-known insight that theologians have cherished for centuries, that the scripture mentions the angels were seen ascending and descending. Logically, one would expect messengers from heaven to first descend. The fact that Jacob first sees them ascending from the earth carries a beautiful and comforting implication. They were already there. They had been with him all along, unseen guardians walking the dusty road beside him, silent watchers in the lonely darkness of the wilderness. Their ascension was simply their return trip from a mission already in progress. This was a quiet, stunning reassurance. In his moment of greatest isolation, Jacob was being shown that he had never, for a single instant, been truly alone. It remains a beautiful mystery of faith to consider that our own world, which can so often feel chaotic and random, might be touched by this same unseen ministry. Jacob was being granted a glimpse behind the veil of physical reality, a peek into the spiritual mechanics of the universe. He was seeing that the space between heaven and earth was not a void, but a highway teeming with holy purpose. His personal, painful journey was taking place within a much larger context of divine care and oversight. The chaos of his own making, the deceptions, and the family strife were all unfolding on a stage that was already and always connected to the profound and orderly peace of heaven. He watched, mesmerized, as the silent, luminous procession continued. Countless messengers of light moved in a serene and unending dance up and down the great stairway. The structure was no longer just a bridge. It was a living artery, pulsing with the life of heaven, a conduit for the will of God. The sheer scale of the activity was overwhelming, a testament to a kingdom far grander than any earthly domain. The vision filled him with a sense of wonder that eclipsed his fear and his guilt. But the ultimate revelation was yet to come. The stairway had a foundation on earth, and the angels traveled its length. But the source of all this glory, the king of this celestial highway, had not yet shown himself. Jacob's sleeping consciousness was completely captivated by the river of light and life flowing up and down the great celestial highway. He was a spectator to a divine secret, a witness to the constant, silent ministry that connects heaven and earth. The vision had already overwhelmed him with its scale and its serene, purposeful beauty, but he was being drawn to look upward. His gaze, following the path of the ascending angels, was pulled to the very top of the stairway, to the pinnacle of the vision, where the structure disappeared into the star-filled blackness. And it was there, at the apex of all this glory, that the source of the vision finally revealed himself. At the top of the stairway, a presence stood. The dream did not, and perhaps could not, provide a detailed form. Human language falters when trying to describe the divine. What Jacob perceived was not a form of flesh and bone, but a being of pure, uncreated light, a figure whose brilliance was the very source of the luminescence that bathed the entire scene. Yet, this was not a terrifying or consuming light. It was a light that radiated an almost unimaginable sense of peace, of absolute authority, held in perfect tranquility. This was the king of this celestial kingdom, the master of the angelic messengers, the anchor of the great bridge that spanned the cosmos. He was the center point, the still and silent source of all the holy activity that flowed before him. It is here that the ancient Hebrew text holds a subtle and beautiful ambiguity, a lesser-known detail that deepens the mystery of this encounter. The original words can be read that the Lord stood above it at the magnificent and distant peak of the stairway. But the phrase can also be translated that the Lord stood beside him. It is a breathtaking possibility. Perhaps the vision was not of a faraway God, observed from a great distance, but something far more intimate. Perhaps, as Jacob lay there on the hard ground, the Lord himself was not just at the top of the stars, but was standing right there in the dust beside him, with the entire cosmic vision unfolding as a backdrop to this profoundly personal encounter. Theologians have cherished both interpretations. The vision of God's transcendent majesty and the vision of his immanent personal presence. Both were true for Jacob in this moment. And then, into the silent awe of the dream, a voice spoke. It was not a sound of crashing thunder or a disembodied echo, but a voice of perfect clarity and authority. A sound that seemed to resonate not in his ears, but in the very center of his soul. It was a voice that cut through all the noise of his guilt and fear. A voice that commanded his complete and undivided attention. And the first words it spoke were words of identity, a declaration that anchored Jacob's fleeting, troubled life into the bedrock of eternal history. "I am the Lord," the voice said, "the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac." In this single, powerful sentence, God defined himself in relation to Jacob's own story. He was not an abstract, philosophical deity or an unknown spirit of the wilderness. He was the God of his grandfather, Abraham, the God who had called a man out of Mesopotamia and made an everlasting covenant with him. He was the God of his father, Isaac, the God who had provided a ram on the mountain and had answered his prayer for a child. Before addressing Jacob or his circumstances, God first established his own unwavering faithfulness through the generations. He was placing Jacob's broken, fearful life into the grand, unbroken narrative of his covenant promise. For the dreamer, this must have been a moment of utter transformation. The God he had heard about in the stories of the elders, the God whose blessing he had so desperately and deceitfully schemed to acquire, was here, and he was speaking to him. This was not a blessing mediated through his blind father, but a direct and personal revelation from the source of all blessing. In that moment, he was no longer Jacob the fugitive, or Jacob the supplanter. He was Jacob, grandson of Abraham, son of Isaac, a known and recognized link in a sacred chain. His personal story, with all its flaws and fears, was being claimed and contextualized by a divine story that was far greater, far older, and far more powerful than his own. The Lord of heaven had appeared, and he knew his name. The voice of God, having identified himself as the God of Jacob's fathers, did not pause for a response. In the logic of the dream, Jacob was a silent and humbled spectator, a pure recipient of the divine word. The God of the covenant, having established his identity, now moved to renew that very covenant, making promises so vast and so gracious that they must have shattered Jacob's small world of fear and guilt. Each promise was a direct and powerful antidote to his current desolate condition. The first promise was for the land, as Jacob lay there, his head on a hard stone, feeling like a landless wanderer with no place to call his own. God spoke directly to his circumstance. "The land on which you are lying," the voice declared, "I will give to you and to your offspring." It was a breathtaking statement. The very ground that was the symbol of his hardship, the dusty, unforgiving earth that was his bed for the night, was now being consecrated as his divine inheritance. The place of his greatest vulnerability was being redefined as the very center of God's promise. This was a direct affirmation of the covenant made with Abraham, who was also told to look upon the land in all directions, for it would be his. The promise was not an abstract, far-off idea. It was as real and as tangible as the stone beneath his head. Having promised him a home, God then promised him a family. Jacob was utterly alone, a man without a wife or a child, a fugitive cut off from his kin. Into this profound loneliness, God spoke a promise of unimaginable fruitfulness. "Your offspring will be like the dust of the earth," he said, "and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south." The metaphor was one of countless, innumerable descendants. He, the solitary man, would become the father of a people so vast they could no more be numbered than the particles of dust stirred by the desert wind. This promise also echoed the one made to his grandfather, Abraham, creating a powerful sense of continuity. Furthermore, the promise that he would spread out to all 4 cardinal directions was a promise of a dynamic, expansive, and unstoppable future. It was the complete opposite of his current life as a man trapped, hiding, and on the run. Then came the third and most significant part of the covenant renewal. The promise that elevated Jacob's personal destiny into a matter of global and eternal significance. And in you and your offspring, God declared, all the peoples of the earth will be blessed. This was the ultimate purpose of the covenant. The blessing Jacob had schemed and lied to obtain for his own personal benefit was now being revealed in its true, magnificent scope. It was never meant to be a private treasure, a tool for one brother to dominate another. It was meant to be a channel, a conduit through which the grace and favor of God would flow out from his family to touch every other family on earth. It is one of the most powerful truths in all of Scripture that God's covenant promises are based not on the merit of the recipient, but on the unwavering faithfulness of the giver. In this moment, God did not mention Jacob's deceit. He did not ask for repentance or a promise of better behavior. He simply bestowed his grace. He was taking Jacob, the flawed and broken supplanter, and was weaving him into the grand tapestry of salvation history. He was formally anointing him as the next steward of the promise that would one day bring redemption to the entire world. Theologians see this unconditional renewal of the covenant as a pure act of divine grace given to a man at the lowest point of his life, a man who had done absolutely nothing to earn it. The blessing was not a reward for his cleverness, but a gift of God's sovereign and inexplicable love. These 3 promises, land, descendants, and a universal blessing, descended upon Jacob in his dream, completely reframing his existence. In the space of a few moments, he was transformed. He was no longer a man defined by the past he was fleeing, but a man defined by the future God was promising. His story was no longer just about a fractured family and a bitter rivalry. It was now about the building of a nation and the blessing of the world. The hard stone of his reality had become the cornerstone of a divine and eternal promise, the grand, multi-generational promises of the covenant hung in the air of Jacob's dream, vast and shimmering like the starry heavens above him. He was to be the father of a great nation, the owner of a promised land, and the vessel of a blessing for the entire world. These were truths so immense, they were almost incomprehensible. But Jacob was still a man with his head on a stone, a fugitive who was terrified of the coming dawn and the dangers the next day's journey would bring. The cosmic promises were for the ages, but he needed a promise for right now. And the God who had just revealed the sweep of salvation history now leaned in a manner of speaking, and whispered a promise meant only for the lonely, fearful man lying in the dust. Having laid out the eternal covenant, God now made a personal one. He brought his focus from the distant future to Jacob's immediate present, speaking words that were a direct and healing balm for his most immediate wounds. "I am with you," God declared. And with these 4 words, the profound loneliness that had been Jacob's constant companion was met by the promise of divine presence. He was not alone on the road. The God who commanded the angelic hosts and stood astride the cosmos was also walking with him, a silent companion in the wilderness. It was the most fundamental and powerful reassurance he could have received. Then God addressed his fear. "And I will watch over you wherever you go," he promised. The ancient Hebrew word for watch over, shamar, is a rich and powerful term. It is the word a shepherd uses for his flock, implying a vigilant, tender, and fiercely protective care. It is the word a watchman on the city walls would use, ever alert to danger. It was a divine promise of guardianship. This promise was a shield against the threat of Esau's vengeance, against the danger of bandits on the road, against the predators that hunted in the night. Jacob, the vulnerable fugitive, was now under the personal protection of the Lord of heaven. Finally, God addressed his uncertain future. Jacob was a man in exile, heading away from his promised home with no guarantee he would ever see it again. Into this uncertainty, God spoke a promise of return. "And I will bring you back to this land," he vowed. This single promise transformed his journey. He was no longer a man wandering into a hopeless, permanent exile. He was on a temporary sojourn, a divinely sanctioned detour with a guaranteed homecoming. His flight now had a purpose and an end point. The promise of the land was not just a future inheritance for his descendants. It was a personal promise that his own feet would stand on this holy ground once more. It is a profound theological truth that the same God who directs the course of nations is also intimately concerned with the fears of a single, troubled heart. The Lord, having just used his covenant name, Yahweh, to renew the promise to Jacob, was establishing a new and deeply personal relationship with him, one that was not just about a grand destiny, but about daily provision and care. To seal these personal promises, God concluded his speech with an unbreakable, unconditional vow. "I will not leave you," he declared, his voice resonating with eternal authority, "until I have done what I have promised you." This was an astonishing statement of divine commitment. The success of this journey and the fulfillment of these promises did not rest on Jacob's strength, his merit, or his ability to remain faithful. It rested entirely on the character and the unwavering faithfulness of God himself. God was placing his own divine honor on the line, binding himself to this flawed, sleeping man. It was a declaration of pure, unmerited grace, a promise that he would see this through to the very end. These personal promises of presence, of protection, of return, and of God's own unwavering faithfulness were the words Jacob's soul desperately needed to hear. They were the anchor for his drifting, fearful heart. The grand covenant promises had redefined his identity, but these intimate promises gave him the strength to face the coming day. The vision had reached its conclusion. The majestic stairway, the ceaseless flow of angels, and the glorious presence of the Lord had all served this dual purpose: to place Jacob within the grand story of salvation, and to assure him that he was personally seen, known, and cared for within that story. The divine voice fell silent, and the radiant light of the dream began to soften, preparing to release the sleeper back to the world of stone and starlight. The glorious light of the vision began to recede. The majestic voice fell silent, and the living procession of angels faded from Jacob's sleeping mind. The divine encounter was over. Consciousness returned to him, not as a gentle dawn, but as a sudden, jarring shock. One moment, his soul was beholding the very gate of heaven. The next, his cheek was pressed against the cold, unyielding surface of a rock. The first sensation to pierce the veil of sleep was not one of lingering glory, but of profound physical discomfort. A deep chill had settled into his bones from the pre-dawn air. His muscles were stiff and sore from the hard ground, and the stone that had served as his pillow now felt like a harsh and alien object beneath his head. He opened his eyes. The world that greeted him was the same desolate, monochrome landscape he had closed his eyes to, now bathed in the thin, gray light that precedes the dawn. The dream, in all its luminous and overwhelming reality, stood in stark and brutal contrast to the gritty, tangible world to which he had awakened. Yet the vision was not a fading memory. It was a searing afterimage, burned into his soul, as real and as present as the stone he could feel and the cold air he could breathe. The boundary between the dream world and the waking world had become porous, and he was trembling in the space between them. The scripture tells us that his first reaction was a simple and powerful one. He was afraid. But this was not the familiar, gnawing fear of his brother's vengeance that had haunted his journey. This was a fear of an entirely different quality. It was a holy fear, a profound and soul-shaking awe that comes from having stood, however briefly, in the presence of the infinite and holy God. It was the natural response of a mortal man to an encounter with the divine, a trembling recognition of his own smallness, his own fleeting and fragile nature in the face of the eternal and all-powerful Creator. He was shaken to his very core, not by a threat, but by a revelation of overwhelming majesty and grace. As he pushed himself into a sitting position on the cold ground, his mind reeled, trying to reconcile the transcendent glory of the dream with the ordinary reality of his surroundings. He looked at the scattered rocks, the sparse, thorny bushes, the dusty earth, and he saw them now with new eyes. This was not just a random patch of wilderness. This was not just a convenient, if uncomfortable place to spend the night. And in a moment of stunning clarity, the truth of his experience washed over him. He spoke the words aloud, his voice perhaps a hoarse whisper in the morning stillness. "Surely," he breathed, "the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." This declaration was a profound confession. First, it was a statement of absolute, unshakable certainty. Surely the Lord is in this place. The experience was not a fantasy, not a figment of his exhausted imagination. It was real. God was here. The divine presence was not confined to the sacred tents of his father in Beersheba, nor to the ancient altars of his grandfather Abraham. God was present in the wild, the untamed, the unexpected places. This was a radical redefinition of sacred geography. Any ground can become holy ground when God chooses to reveal himself there. The second half of his statement was a confession of his own spiritual blindness. And I did not know it. It was a humble admission of his own limitations. He had been so consumed by his own fears, his own guilt, and his own plans for survival, that he had been completely oblivious to the sacred reality that permeated the very air he was breathing. He had seen the place as desolate, but it was in fact divine. He had felt alone. but he had been in the very presence of God. His awe continued to deepen as he spoke again, giving a name to the nature of this holy ground. "How awesome is this place!" he exclaimed. The Hebrew word for awesome comes from the very same root as the word for fear. He was naming the trembling in his soul. This was a fearsome, wonderful, and holy place. And then his understanding crystallized further. "This is none other than the house of God," he declared, "and this is the gate of heaven." The vision had not been just a symbol. It had been a revelation of the true nature of this spot. It was a Beth El, a house of God, a place where the divine presence dwelled. And it was a portal, a gateway, the very place where the stairway had connected the dust of the earth to the glory of heaven. The fugitive had unknowingly stumbled upon a divine junction, a place where the veil between the worlds was thin. The world around him had not changed, but his perception of it had been transformed forever. The words lingered in the cold morning air, spoken as much to himself as to the silent world around him. "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." This was more than a mere observation. It was the anchor point of a profound and seismic shift in Jacob's entire understanding of reality. In the moments that followed his trembling declaration, as the initial shock of the vision began to subside, the deep and life-altering implications of this new knowledge started to settle into his soul. The world he had woken up in looked the same as the one he had fallen asleep in, but in a fundamental way, everything had changed. Before this night, his world had been governed by human action and reaction. Life was a matter of clever planning, of seizing opportunities, of navigating complex family dynamics, and of surviving by one's own wits. God was a distant figure in this equation, the God of his fathers, a being to be acknowledged in blessings and oaths, but not a present, active force in the dusty struggles of daily life. Jacob had been living in a two-dimensional world, seeing only the horizontal plane of human striving. The dream, however, had revealed a third, vertical dimension. He now understood that the physical world he could see and touch was interwoven with a spiritual reality he had been completely blind to. The gate of heaven was not in some mythical, far-away realm. It was right here, in this lonely field. This holy realization began to reframe the very nature of his journey. He was not simply a fugitive running from the consequences of his actions. His desperate flight was, in fact, a divinely guided pilgrimage. He was not just running from his brother's hatred in the south. He was being actively led toward his destiny in the north. The presence of God promised to him in the dream was not a future hope, but a present reality. The path ahead was still fraught with uncertainty and danger, but it was no longer a path he walked alone. The God of the universe was his unseen traveling companion, watching over him as he had promised. This desolate wilderness was not a place of punishment, but a place of encounter, a necessary stop on a sacred itinerary he never knew he was following. It remains a cornerstone of the mystery of grace that God does not wait for us to find a holy place to worship him. He breaks into our ordinary, unholy places and makes them sacred by his presence. In Jacob's time, and in the great empires that surrounded his people, it was believed that humans built temples and ziggurats to invite the presence of their gods, to create a space where the divine might choose to descend. But what Jacob realized in this moment was the opposite, a truth that would become foundational to the faith of his descendants. A place is not made holy by the stones that humans pile up, but by the glory of the God who chooses to reveal himself there. The holiness of this place was not in the earth or the rocks, but in the fact that God had been there. The encounter itself was what consecrated the ground. His personal relationship with God was also being fundamentally redefined. The faith of his father, Isaac, and his grandfather, Abraham, had been a story he inherited. He knew the tales of the covenant, the sacrifice on Moriah, the answered prayers, but it had all been second-hand knowledge, a family history rather than a personal reality. Now, it was his own. God had spoken his name. God had renewed the covenant with him directly. This was the true birth of Jacob's own personal faith. It was a faith born not in the comfort of his father's tents, but here, in the cold and the dark, on the hardest of pillows. The God of his fathers had now, truly and irrevocably, become his God, as he sat there in the growing light of the morning. The magnitude of these realizations settled upon him. The awe and fear were still present, but they were now mingled with a profound sense of purpose and wonder. He was a participant in something immense and holy, and this new knowledge was not something he could simply hold in his mind as a comforting thought. A realization so powerful demanded a response. An encounter so holy demanded to be commemorated. His eyes fell upon the stone he had used for a pillow, the silent witness to his night of transformation. It was no longer just a rock. It was an altar, a memorial, a testament to the night the heavens opened. He knew with a certainty that came from the depths of his being that he could not simply walk away from this place as if nothing had happened. He had to mark it. He had to respond. The new awareness that had dawned in Jacob's soul was met by the rising of the physical sun. As the first rays of light spilled over the eastern hills, chasing away the last of the morning shadows, the time for trembling reflection was over. An encounter so profound, a revelation so life-altering, demanded more than just a quiet, internal acknowledgement. It demanded a response, a physical act that could give voice to the overwhelming awe and gratitude that filled his heart. He could not and would not simply walk away from this sacred ground as if it were any other place. The scripture tells us that he rose early in the morning, his movements now filled with a new and solemn purpose. His fear had not vanished, but it had been transformed into a holy reverence that compelled him to act. He turned to the very instrument of his discomfort, the object that had so perfectly symbolized his hard and lonely reality. He reached for the stone that he had used as a pillow. It was a rough, ordinary field stone, one of thousands scattered across the landscape. But to him, it was now a precious relic, a silent witness to the night the heavens had opened. He lifted the stone, its weight a solid and grounding presence in his hands. This was real. The dream was real. The God who had spoken to him is real. He did not cast the stone aside, but with deliberate care, he set it up on its end, turning it from a simple, horizontal resting place into a vertical marker. He created a pillar, a matseva in the ancient tongue. In his culture, this was a deeply significant act. Standing stones were monuments, markers set up to commemorate a great victory, to seal a covenant between two parties, or, most importantly, to mark a spot where the divine had intersected with the human world. It was a story told in stone, a permanent testament for any future traveler who might pass this way, a silent declaration that something of immense importance had happened right here. But the act was not yet complete. A marker acknowledges the past, but Jacob needed to consecrate the present. He reached into the small leather bag that held his meager travel provisions. From it, he took out a flask of olive oil. For a long-distance traveler in the ancient world, oil was a precious and essential commodity. It was fuel for a lamp in the darkness, a salve for wounds and sun-scorched skin, and a vital ingredient for cooking. To use it for any other purpose was a true sacrifice, a giving away of something necessary for his own survival. Holding the flask, he performed his first priestly act. He slowly and reverently poured the glistening golden oil over the top of the stone pillar. The oil trickled down its rough sides, catching the morning light and making the dull rock shine as if with an inner glow. This act of anointing was the ultimate gesture of consecration. It was how holy priests, prophets, and kings were set apart for their sacred duties. It was how the tabernacle and all its furnishings would one day be dedicated for the service of God. By anointing this stone, Jacob was formally and powerfully declaring it to be set apart, no longer a common object, but something holy, belonging entirely to God. It is a profound testament to the nature of true worship, that it does not require grand cathedrals or elaborate rituals. It requires only a responsive heart, using the ordinary materials of life to honor a holy God. Jacob had no temple, no ordained priest, no sacrificial lamb. He had only a rock from the ground and a little oil from his bag. But with those simple elements, he performed an act of worship as pure and as powerful as any that would later take place in the great temple in Jerusalem. He gave what he had, a sacrifice of his precious resources, as an external sign of the internal transformation that had taken place. The pouring out of the oil was a physical manifestation of his soul, pouring out its awe, its gratitude, and its allegiance to the God who had met him in his moment of greatest need. The fugitive had become a worshiper. The supplanter had become a priest. And in the quiet of the morning, the solitary, glistening stone now stood as a silent, sacred witness. The sun had now climbed higher, and the morning light illuminated the solitary, glistening pillar that stood as a testament to the night's events. Jacob had responded to the divine vision with a physical act of worship, consecrating the stone of his hardship and setting it apart as holy. Yet his response felt incomplete. A monument, however sacred, is mute. To truly commemorate the encounter, to give it a voice that would echo through the generations, he needed to give the place a name that would forever tell the story of what had happened there. He needed to align the human name for this place with the divine reality he now knew it to possess. The scripture tells us that before this morning, the place had a name. It was a nearby Canaanite town known as Luz. The name likely meant almond tree, a simple earthly name for a place that was perhaps known for a grove of those hardy, beautiful trees. Luz was a name of the land, a botanical label. It spoke of the visible, the natural, the ordinary. It was a name that described what the place was in the eyes of the world. A common stop on a well-trod path, a place one might pass through without a second thought, just as Jacob had. It was a name that belonged to the world of his spiritual blindness, the world he had inhabited just the day before. But Jacob, standing there in the awe of his new awareness, knew that Luz was no longer sufficient. It was a name that described the outer shell, but not the inner truth. And so, drawing on the very words of his own awestruck declaration, he gave the place its new and eternal name. He called it Bethel. In the ancient Hebrew tongue, the name is a simple and powerful combination of two words. Beth, meaning house, dwelling place, or family. And El, one of the oldest and most foundational names for God, signifying the Mighty One, the Creator, the ultimate power and authority. Bethel, the house of God. In the ancient world, the act of naming was an exercise of authority and a declaration of essence. It was God who named the day and the night in the act of creation, defining their purpose. It was Adam who named the animals, an act of his stewardship over the earth. God renamed Abram to Abraham, father of a multitude, to define his new destiny. For Jacob to rename this place was a bold and significant act. It was the first fruit of the authority bestowed upon him in the blessing. He was no longer just a passive observer of the land. He was now acting upon it, defining its true character in light of the divine revelation he had received. He was peeling away the common earthly name of Luz to reveal the sacred spiritual name that had been waiting underneath. It is a beautiful mystery how human words, when spoken in response to a divine encounter, can take on a sacred and creative power. The ground was already holy because God had revealed himself there. But in the act of naming it, Bethel, Jacob was aligning the human understanding with the heavenly reality. He was creating a landmark, not just on a physical map, but on a spiritual one. He was ensuring that the memory of this event would not fade with his own passing, but would be embedded in the very name of the place, a permanent invitation for all future travelers to recognize that they too were standing on holy ground. The transformation of Luz into Bethel was a perfect mirror of the transformation that was taking place within Jacob himself. He had arrived at Luz as a fugitive, a man of earthly schemes, his vision limited to the horizontal plane of his own survival. He was, in a sense, Jacob of Luz, a man of the common and the ordinary, but he would be leaving Bethel as a patriarch, a man who had seen the vertical connection between heaven and earth, a man entrusted with a holy promise. The journey from Luz to Bethel was the journey from seeing only the almond trees to seeing the angels of God. from spiritual blindness to spiritual sight. The place had not changed, but Jacob had, and through his act of naming, he changed the identity of the place forever. The anointed stone now had a name, and its name was a sermon. Standing in the quiet of the morning before the newly consecrated pillar, Jacob had completed his immediate response to the divine vision. He had honored the moment with a physical monument and honored the place with a sacred name. His soul, once a storm of fear and guilt, was now settled into a state of profound and reverent awe. But the journey was not over. The sun was climbing higher, and the long road to Haran still stretched before him. The grand, cosmic promises and the intimate, personal assurances he had received in the dream now needed to be translated into the practical reality of the road ahead. And so, Jacob, the man of calculation and negotiation, responded to God's grace in the primary way he knew how. He made a vow. It was a solemn declaration, a formal agreement made between himself and the God who had just revealed himself. And it was, in its structure, a conditional vow, a classic if-then statement that so perfectly reflected Jacob's practical and cautious nature. He began by taking the very promises God had just freely given him and laying them down as the foundation of the agreement. "If God will be with me," he began, his voice echoing God's own promise of presence, "and will watch over me on this journey I am taking," he continued, turning the promise of protection into a condition of the vow. He then added his own immediate human needs into the bargain, the basic necessities of survival that were at the forefront of his mind. "And will give me food to eat and clothes to wear." It was the simple, honest plea of a destitute traveler, a request for daily bread from the God who had just promised him the world. Finally, he sealed the conditions by repeating the promise that had given him the most hope. "So that I return safely to my father's household." He had heard God's promise, and now he was formally holding God to his word, building his own commitment upon the bedrock of God's faithfulness. Having laid out the conditions, he then declared his side of the covenant, the solemn promises he would keep. "Then," he declared, "the Lord will be my God." This was the most significant part of his vow. It was a formal declaration of personal allegiance. The God of Abraham and Isaac would no longer be just his ancestral deity. He would be his personal God. He was pledging exclusive loyalty, a foundational act of faith for a man about to journey into the heart of Mesopotamia, a land filled with a pantheon of other gods. Next, he honored the place of his encounter. "And this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house," he vowed. He was promising to fulfill the meaning of the name he had just given it. Upon his safe return, he would recognize this place not just as a memorial of a past event, but as an active sanctuary, a permanent place of worship, a true house of God. Finally, he pledged his own resources. "And of all that you give me," he promised, "I will surely give a full 10th to you." This is the first instance in the sacred narrative of an individual pledging a tithe. It was a tangible promise of gratitude and a radical acknowledgement that everything he would ever own, all the future wealth he might accumulate, would ultimately come from God. It was his way of promising that he would never forget the source of his blessing. It reveals a beautiful truth about God's character, that he is not offended by our stumbling, transactional attempts at faith. Jacob's conditional vow, coming immediately after God's unconditional promises, can seem jarring. But it was the genuine response of a man who was only just beginning his journey of faith. He was relating to God in the language he understood best, that of a binding agreement. God met him right there, accepting his fledgling, bargaining vow as a true and sincere step toward a deeper relationship. With his vow made, the encounter at Bethel was complete. He had been given a vision of heaven, and he had responded with acts of worship on earth. He had received a promise for the future, and he had made a promise of his own in return. The sun was now fully illuminating the landscape. It was time to go. He turned away from the glistening, anointed stone, the first altar of his new faith. He turned his back on the house of God and faced the road to Haran once more. He was still a man with only a staff in his hand, but he was no longer the same man who had laid his head on the stone the night before. He walked now, not with the heavy shuffle of a fearful fugitive, but with the steady, purposeful stride of a man who knew, with absolute certainty, that he did not walk alone. The newly named House of God, marked by its simple, glistening stone, stood behind him. The vow he had made, a testament to his fledgling faith, echoed in his heart. Jacob, the man who had arrived at this place as a broken fugitive, now turned to face the eastward road. He had done all he could do. He had received the vision. He had responded in worship. And he had made a commitment. Now there was nothing left to do but walk. And the way he walked, the very rhythm of his journey, was about to change completely. The sacred text describes this moment with a beautiful, and subtle phrase. It does not simply say, Jacob continued his journey. The original Hebrew is more poetic, more full of life. It says, then Jacob lifted up his feet. It is a small detail, but it contains a world of meaning. It speaks of a profound and immediate transformation in the very spirit of the man. Before his night at Bethel, his journey had been a flight. His steps were surely heavy, hesitant. The weary shuffle of a man burdened by guilt and hunted by fear. Every footstep was an effort, each mile a testament to the sorrow he was leaving behind and the terror he imagined before him. He was a man being pushed forward by the ghosts of his past, but now he lifted up his feet. This is the language of eagerness, of lightness, of a new and surprising energy. His feet did not drag in the dust. They rose with a sense of purpose. The journey was no longer an escape. It had become a mission. The road was no longer a path of exile. It was a divinely sanctioned pilgrimage. The fear of Esau, while likely still a present memory, was no longer the driving force of his life. It had been superseded by a greater reality, the promise of God's own presence and protection. He was no longer a man looking over his shoulder, but a man looking toward the horizon, anticipating the fulfillment of a holy promise. The crushing loneliness that had defined the first leg of his journey had also been transformed. The physical landscape was the same stony hills, the same relentless sun, the same vast and empty sky. He was still, to any outside observer, a man utterly alone, but his internal landscape had been repopulated. He now walked in the quiet, constant awareness of a divine companion. It is a profound spiritual mystery how a single moment of grace can completely recontextualize a lifetime of struggle. The external facts of Jacob's situation had not changed. His brother was still angry. His home was still hundreds of miles away. He was still a man with virtually no possessions. But the divine promise had changed the meaning of every one of those facts. His poverty was temporary. His exile had a guaranteed end date, and his safety was assured by the Lord of the universe. And so he walked. The miles that had once been a measure of his distance from home now became a measure of his progress toward his destiny. The sun that had once been a relentless adversary was now a steady companion, lighting the path God had laid before him. The nights, once a time for wrestling with his conscience, now became a time for peaceful rest, a quiet space to reflect on the vision of the shining stairway and the voice that had spoken his name. The guilt of his past had not been magically erased, but it had been placed in a new context. His identity was no longer defined by his worst moments as a supplanter, but by his highest calling as the chosen heir of the Abrahamic covenant. He was on his way to Haran, not just to find a wife, but to begin the process of becoming a great nation. For days, perhaps weeks, he traveled with this new spirit, this lightness in his step. He crossed the Jordan River with his staff, forded streams, and navigated the ancient trade routes that led northeast toward Mesopotamia. The further he went, the more the landscape began to change, growing less barren, more fertile. He began to see signs of a different kind of life. The green of irrigated fields and the dark, familiar shapes of flocks of sheep grazing in the distance. And then, one day, after a long and arduous journey that had begun in fear and was now ending in faith, he looked ahead and saw his destination. Near the settlement of Haran, in the land of his ancestors, he saw a well in an open field, and around it, the flocks and the shepherds that signified the end of his journey through the wilderness. He had arrived. He was no longer the broken man who had laid his head on a stone, but a man of faith and purpose, ready for the next chapter of the story God was writing for him. Jacob had arrived at the edge of his new life, his heart filled with the quiet confidence of the promise he had received at Bethel. His arrival at the well in Haran was marked by a strength and assurance that was new to him, and his first encounter with his kinsman was one of immediate success. He met the beautiful shepherdess Rachel, the daughter of his uncle Laban, and in an act of joyous strength, he single-handedly rolled away the great stone covering the community well to water her flock. He was welcomed into Laban's household not as a fearful fugitive, but as a treasured relative. The first part of his journey was over, and it seemed as though the path ahead would be smooth and blessed. But the years in Haran would prove to be a trial of a different sort, a long and difficult crucible designed to refine the character of the man God had chosen. For the next 20 years, Jacob's life would be defined by hardship, toil, and a constant, draining battle of wits against his cunning and greedy uncle. And in a profound and deeply ironic turn of events, Jacob, the great supplanter, the master of deceit, would now find himself the victim of deception. It is a profound and often difficult mystery of the spiritual life that God sometimes allows us to experience the very same pain we have caused others, not as a cruel punishment, but as a form of divine empathy training. Jacob had to learn, through bitter experience, the sting of betrayal, After working for 7 years, a labor that felt like only a few days because of his great love for Rachel, he was tricked on his wedding night and found himself married not to his beloved, but to her older sister, Leah. His life became a tapestry of struggle. He was forced to work another 7 years to finally earn the right to marry Rachel, the wife of his heart. 14 years of his life were spent in hard labor just for his wives. His home, far from being a place of peace, became a house of bitter rivalry between the two sisters, a constant, sorrowful competition for his affection that produced a large but deeply fractured family. The pain of a divided household, a pain he had helped create in his own father's tent, was now his own daily reality. After his years of service for his wives were complete, he continued to work for Laban, and his uncle changed his wages 10 times, constantly seeking to cheat and exploit him. Through all of this, through the betrayal, the long years of toil, the family strife, and the financial manipulation, Jacob endured. And the source of his endurance, the secret anchor that kept his hope from being extinguished, was the memory of his night at Bethel. That vision was not just a pleasant dream from his past. It was a living and active promise that shaped his present and guaranteed his future. When he was deceived by Laban, he could have fallen into despair, but the memory of Bethel would have reminded him that his ultimate destiny was not in the hands of a deceitful man, but in the hands of a faithful God. The promise of divine presence, "I am with you," was his assurance that he was not alone, even in this den of treachery. During the long, hard years of shepherding Laban's flocks under a scorching sun, he would have looked at his growing family, at the sons being born to him through Leah and Rachel and their handmaidens, and he would have seen the tangible fulfillment of God's promise. The vow of offspring like the dust of the earth was not just a far-off idea. It was being woven into the fabric of his daily life, a constant reminder that God's plan was quietly unfolding, even amidst the jealousy and the sorrow. And when Laban tried to cheat him of his earnings, Jacob learned to rely not on his own cunning, but on the God who had promised him provision. He remembered the simple, practical part of his vow. To the God who would give him food to eat and clothes to wear. And he trusted that the Lord would see to his needs. The memory of the stairway, the angels, and the voice of God was his secret source of strength, a truth that Laban's greed could not touch, a promise that human fallibility could not nullify. Theologians see these 20 years as the school of Jacob's character. The prideful schemer had to learn patience. The supplanter had to learn humility. He had to be broken of his reliance on his own cleverness before God could truly bless him. And so, after 2 long decades, the man who had arrived with nothing but a staff was now the head of a large family and the owner of immense flocks. The promises of Bethel had been steadily, quietly, and faithfully kept. 20 years had passed in the land of Haran, a long and arduous exile that had transformed the solitary fugitive into the wealthy patriarch of a sprawling clan. The God of Bethel had been faithful. He had provided Jacob with a large family and immense flocks, fulfilling the promises of descendants and provision. But one promise remained, the one that required the most courage to claim, the promise of return. And so, one day, the voice of God came to him again, clear and direct. Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. The time for his sojourn was over. The journey home was about to begin. His departure from Haran was as fraught with conflict as his arrival had been. He fled from the resentful and duplicitous Laban, his own family, now a great and slow-moving caravan of women, children, servants, and livestock. The contrast with his first journey was staggering. He had left his home with nothing but a staff. He was returning as a testament to God's blessing, a moving portrait of the promise to make him fruitful. As he re-entered the borders of the promised land, he was met by a vision. The scripture says, the angels of God met him, and he named the place Mahanaim, meaning 2 camps, his own earthly camp and the heavenly camp of God's angelic army. It was a divine reassurance, a quiet echo of the Bethel vision, reminding him that the heavenly messengers who had ascended and descended the great stairway were still with him, guarding his path. But this angelic encouragement was soon overshadowed by a far older and deeper fear. The closer he came to his homeland, the larger the shadow of his brother Esau loomed in his mind. 20 years was a long time, but was it long enough to cool a murderous rage? Jacob, the master strategist, fell back on his old ways. He sent messengers ahead with gifts, attempting to appease the brother he had so grievously wronged. When the messengers returned with the terrifying news that Esau was coming to meet him with 400 men, Jacob was gripped by a terror that erased 20 years of accumulated wealth and status. In his distress, he divided his family and flocks into 2 groups, hoping one might escape if the other was attacked. And then he prayed. It was a desperate, heartfelt prayer, the prayer of a man at the end of his own resources. He reminded God of the command to return and the promise of protection, pleading, "I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become 2 camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau." Having done all he could do, strategizing, praying, and sending lavish gifts ahead, he sent his family and all his possessions across the Jabbok River during the night. And once again, just as it had been at Bethel, Jacob was left completely alone in the darkness. It was in this place of solitude and terror that his second great divine encounter occurred. A man appeared out of the darkness and began to wrestle with him, and the struggle continued until the first light of dawn. This was not a vision or a dream, but a physical, grueling, and intimate battle. It was a contest of sinew and will, a silent, all-night struggle by the riverbank. As the dawn approached, the mysterious man, seeing that he could not overpower Jacob, reached out and touched the socket of Jacob's hip, wrenching it from its joint. With a single touch, Jacob's physical strength was broken. He was wounded and disabled. Yet, in that moment of physical defeat, a new kind of strength emerged in Jacob. Though crippled and in pain, he did not release his hold. He clung to his opponent with a desperate, tenacious grip. "Let me go," the man said, "for it is daybreak." But Jacob, gasping for breath, spoke the words that would define his new identity. "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man who had once stolen a blessing through deceit now wrestled for one through sheer, desperate endurance. The man asked him, "What is your name?" And in the growing light of the new day, he confessed his identity. Jacob, the supplanter, the deceiver. In response, the man gave him a new name and a new identity. "Your name will no longer be Jacob," he declared, "but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." His name was changed from one who grasps to one who wrestles with God. He was then blessed there by the river. As the sun rose, Jacob, now Israel, limped away from the place he named Peniel, meaning the face of God. "For I have seen God face to face," he said, "and my life has been spared." He had been blessed, but he had also been broken. The limp he would carry for the rest of his days was a permanent reminder that his greatest strength was now found not in his own cunning, but in his weakness and his tenacious dependence on the God with whom he had wrestled and prevailed. Limping, yet blessed, Jacob Now Israel rose from the banks of the Jabbok River and went to face his past. The terror of his brother, Esau, a fear that had haunted him for 2 decades and driven him into a desperate, all-night struggle with God, was now before him. He arranged his family, placing his most beloved, Rachel and Joseph, at the very back, and he himself went on ahead. The man who had once used cunning and disguise to steal from his brother now approached with profound and vulnerable humility. He did not walk, but bowed, prostrating himself on the ground 7 times as he drew near. This was not the act of a proud patriarch, but of a penitent, a man broken of his own strength, leaning entirely on the new blessing he had received. And in a moment of stunning, miraculous grace, the threat that had defined his life for 20 years dissolved into an embrace. Esau, the fierce hunter, the man who had vowed murder, saw his brother's humility, and his heart melted. He ran to meet him, threw his arms around his neck, and wept. The feud was over. The years of bitterness were washed away in a flood of forgiveness. The blessing Jacob had wrestled for at Peniel now manifested itself in the human world as reconciliation. He had struggled with God and prevailed, and now he had found favor with the man he had wronged. The great fear that had been the catalyst for his entire journey into exile was finally, completely, and mercifully extinguished. But the fulfillment of his vow at Bethel was not his next immediate step. The path of life, even a life under a divine promise, is rarely a straight line. After his peaceful parting with Esau, Jacob journeyed on, settling for a time in Sukkoth, and later buying a plot of land and pitching his tents near the city of Shechem. Years passed. His family grew, and it was here, in Shechem, that his household was struck by a horrific tragedy involving the violation of his daughter, Dinah, leading to a brutal and bloody act of vengeance by his sons, Simeon and Levi. The blessing did not make him immune to sorrow, and the promise did not shield his family from the violent consequences of human sin. His new identity as Israel did not erase the profound challenges of being a father and a leader in a dangerous world. It was after this dark and traumatic period that the voice of God spoke to him again, calling him back to the origin of his hope. Go up to Bethel and settle there, God commanded. Build an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau. It was a divine summons to remember. After 20 long years, after wrestling and reconciliation, after prosperity and pain. It was time to finally go back and fulfill the vow he had made as a lonely, fearful fugitive. Jacob's response was immediate and decisive, the response of a man who had learned to obey. He turned to his entire household and gave a command that revealed the depth of his transformation. "Get rid of the foreign gods you have with you," he ordered, "and purify yourselves and change your clothes." He was now acting as the spiritual head of his family. Before they could go to the house of God, he knew that his own house had to be cleansed of the idols and pagan trinkets they had acquired from their long years in Harn. He was no longer just the recipient of the blessing. He was now its guardian, the patriarch charged with leading his family in purity and true worship. And so they journeyed from Shechem to Bethel. As they traveled, a holy fear, the scripture says, a terror of God, fell upon the surrounding towns, so that no one dared to pursue them. The God who had promised to protect him was still his shield. When he finally arrived at that certain place, the place once called Luz, it must have been a moment of overwhelming emotion. He had left this spot as a destitute young man with only a staff. He now returned as God had promised, a great patriarch, surrounded by his children, his servants, and his flocks. He stood once more on the holy ground, a living testament to the faithfulness of God. There, as he had vowed so long ago, he built an altar. This was not just a single stone pillar, but a formal place of communal worship for his entire family. And he called the place El Bethel, the God of the house of God, reaffirming and deepening the name he had given it as a youth. The circle was now complete. The promise of return, which had seemed so distant, had been fulfilled. The vow, made in a moment of fearful bargaining, was now honored in a moment of mature and grateful worship. The long chapter of his exile was finally and formally closed. The altar Jacob built at Bethel marked the fulfillment of his personal vow, a circle completed after 20 long and transformative years. It was the closing of a chapter in the life of one man. But the vision that had been granted to him on that holy ground was not destined to be a private memory. The meaning of the great shining stairway and the God who stood above it was only just beginning its long journey, echoing down through the centuries and becoming a cornerstone of spiritual hope for millions. The ladder's true ascent was just beginning. In the immediate history of Jacob's descendants, the nation of Israel, Bethel became one of the most revered and significant holy sites in the Promised Land. The memory of God's appearance to their great ancestor consecrated the ground. For a time, during the turbulent era of the Judges, the Ark of the Covenant itself, the very symbol of God's presence on earth, rested at Bethel. It became a center for worship and a place of pilgrimage, a site where the prophet Samuel would travel to administer justice and seek the word of the Lord. The personal house of God that Jacob had identified became a national sanctuary for his children. The vision's legacy was first written into the sacred geography of a nation. Tragically, Bethel's holiness also made it a target for corruption. Centuries later, when the kingdom of Israel was divided, King Jeroboam, fearing that his people would return to Jerusalem to worship, set up a golden calf at Bethel, turning a place of true and awesome divine encounter into a center for idolatry. It is a sorrowful testament to the human condition that the very places touched by God's purest revelations can be desecrated by human fear and faithlessness. Yet, even this dark chapter could not erase the power of the original vision, serving instead as a stark contrast that made its memory shine all the brighter. Beyond the physical location, the image of the ladder itself took on a life of its own within the spiritual imagination of the Jewish people. The sages and rabbis who studied the sacred texts for generations saw in the Sulam a wealth of symbolic meaning. To many, it was a perfect metaphor for prayer. The angels ascending represented the heartfelt prayers of the faithful, rising from the earth to the throne of God. The angels descending represented God's answers, His grace, His mercy, and His help, flowing back down to humanity. The vision was a promise that the channel of communication is always open, a constant two-way flow between God and His people. In some rabbinic traditions, the vision took on a historical and prophetic dimension. It was said that Jacob saw in his dream the angelic princes or patrons of the great world empires that would one day dominate his descendants: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. He saw each angel ascend the ladder a certain number of rungs, representing the height of its power, and then fall back down into the dust, symbolizing its eventual collapse. But the angel representing his own people, Israel, ascended and did not fall, a divine promise of their ultimate and eternal endurance. The ladder thus became a symbol of divine providence, a reassurance that God was in control of the grand sweep of history, overseeing the rise and fall of all earthly kingdoms. It is a profound mystery of sacred storytelling, how a single, enigmatic vision given to one man can become a timeless and universal symbol for humanity's deepest spiritual longings. The image of the ladder has also been interpreted as a powerful metaphor for the individual's journey of the soul. The base of the ladder rests on the earth, in our common daily struggles, while its top reaches into heaven, toward our spiritual aspirations. Each rung represents a step upward in faith, a new virtue to be mastered, a deeper level of communion with the divine. It is an image of progress, of hope, of the possibility of spiritual ascent. This interpretation has resonated for millennia, inspiring countless works of theology, poetry, and art, far beyond the confines of Jacob's own story. From a personal promise of protection, the vision's meaning had expanded to become a national landmark, a symbol of prayer, a map of divine providence, and a guide for the soul. The echo of Jacob's dreams growing ever louder, waiting for its final and ultimate fulfillment. For centuries, the vision of Jacob's ladder stood as a powerful symbol of hope, a profound promise that the heavens were not sealed, and that God was intimately involved with the world. The image echoed through the spiritual history of his descendants, taking on layers of meaning, a symbol of prayer, of divine providence, of the soul's ascent. But the vision was, in its essence, a promise, a shadow of a greater reality yet to come. The full, breathtaking meaning of what Jacob saw in his dream would remain a holy mystery for nearly 2,000 years, until one day, on another dusty road in the Promised Land, Jesus himself would finally reveal the ladder's true identity. The revelation came in a quiet conversation with a man named Nathanael, recorded in the Gospel of John. When Jesus saw him approaching, he declared, "Here truly is an Israelite, in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael, startled by this, asked how Jesus knew him. Jesus' reply was simple and supernatural. "I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you." Struck to the core by this impossible knowledge, Nathanael made a great confession of faith. "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." It was Jesus' response to this confession that unveiled the ultimate meaning of Jacob's dream. He looked at Nathanael, this true and guileless Israel, and made him a promise. "You believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree," Jesus said. "You will see greater things than that." And then he spoke the words that connected his own identity directly to that ancient vision at Bethel. "Very truly I tell you, you will see heaven open, and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." It is the most profound and beautiful mystery of the faith that the deepest longings and symbols of the Old Testament find their ultimate answer in the person of Jesus Christ. With these words, Jesus declared that he himself is the true ladder. He is the bridge. He is the real and living connection between heaven and earth. The stairway Jacob saw was a temporary vision, a promise of a connection. Jesus, in his very being, is that connection. He is the one whose feet are firmly set up on the earth through his perfect humanity, and whose head reaches to heaven in his perfect divinity. He is the new Bethel, the new house of God. The place where humanity can meet God is no longer a location on a map, but a person. The angels who in Jacob's dream ascended and descended upon a structure are now seen ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. Jesus is the conduit of all divine communication and ministry. All the grace, mercy, and guidance of God flows down to humanity through him, and all the prayers, the worship, and the needs of humanity rise up to God through him. He is the sole mediator, the great high priest, the one and only pathway. The dream given to Jacob, the supplanter, in a moment of desperate grace, finds its ultimate fulfillment in this conversation with Nathanael, the true Israelite, without deceit. The hope of an open heaven is no longer a fleeting dream, but a living, breathing reality in Christ. The story of Jacob's ladder, then, is not just the tale of an ancient patriarch's dream. It is our story. It is the story of a humanity that feels cut off, exiled, and alone, sleeping on the hard ground of a difficult world. It is the story of our deep and desperate need for a connection to the divine, for a way back to the house of God. And it is the story of the stunning, breathtaking revelation that God, in his infinite love, did not just show us the ladder. He became the ladder and invites us to find in him our one true way home. And so, our long journey with Jacob comes to a close. The story that began in fear and deception, a tale of a broken family and a fugitive son, ends here, with a promise fulfilled in the most unexpected way. The lonely field at Luz was transformed into Bethel, the house of God, and Bethel itself was a signpost, pointing down through the ages to the one who is the true dwelling place of God among us. As you settle into your rest now, let the gentle images of the story soothe your mind. Picture the quiet of the wilderness, the vast and silent canopy of stars. Imagine the soft, shimmering light of that celestial stairway, a silent promise of connection, a bridge to a place of peace. Remember the serene and purposeful movement of the angels, a constant, quiet ministry of divine care that watches over our world, even when we are unaware. The same God who met a lonely traveler on a hard road is present with you now, The same grace that turned a stone pillow into a holy altar can turn your own place of rest into a sanctuary. Let go of the struggles of the day, the worries of tomorrow. There is a peace that underpins all the chaos of our world, a divine presence that is always with you, a connection to heaven that is always open. Allow your breathing to slow and your thoughts to soften. Rest now in the assurance that you are seen, you are known, and you are never, ever alone.